They thought the wall would last forever. They poured concrete into the heart of Berlin, unrolled barbed wire through family homes, and posted young men with rifles as if they could hold back history at gunpoint. And yet, on that thin line of stone and steel, something extraordinary happened. Technology, courage, and a very American kind of stubbornness combined to push back against the most fortified border in Europe. This is the story of how East German border guards, the feared VoPos, became both hunters and hunted along the Berlin Wall. It is the story of gunfire over a concrete barrier, of young men in uniform who were ordered to shoot their own people, and of a technological and psychological war that the Soviets slowly realized they were losing. On one side stood the Soviet-backed German Democratic Republic, the GDR, armed with Kalashnikovs, searchlights, mines, tripwires, and concrete watchtowers. On the other side stood the West, American soldiers, West Berlin police, and a city whose very survival depended on keeping a narrow island of freedom open, supplied, and wired into the most advanced economy on Earth. For Americans watching back then, and for us watching now, it is almost impossible not to feel a certain pride. Pride in the airlift that kept Berlin alive. Pride in the electronics, the cameras, the aircraft, the radios and reconnaissance that outclassed Soviet systems. Pride in the fact that in this strange, divided city, the free side stayed free. But this is not just a story of machines. It is a story of people. People trapped, people escaping, and people in uniform forced to choose between orders and conscience. And sometimes those choices were made under a rain of bullets crossing the wall. Let us begin on a narrow street that became world famous, Bernauer Strasse. Before the wall, Bernauer Strasse was just another busy city street, lined with apartment buildings, shops, and families who had lived there for generations. The oddity of history was that the front doors and windows of those houses opened into West Berlin, while their backyards lay in the east. When the border hardened in 1961, this street suddenly became one of the most dangerous places in Europe. In August 1961, East German police and party militia began walling up the doors and windows that faced West Berlin, brick by brick. Residents woke up to find armed men in their stairwells, ordering them out, sealing their homes, and posting guards in front of what had been their front doors. Some refused to accept that this was the end. People began jumping. From second-floor windows, from balconies, even from rooftops, East Berliners hurled themselves into the waiting nets of West Berlin firemen. On the sidewalks below, West Berliners watched in shock as neighbors literally flew across the border. But the VoPos were watching too, and they had orders: stop the escapes at any cost. Just weeks later, the escalations at Bernauer Strasse would bring the border to the edge of open war. A man named Bernd Linzer decided he would not live behind a wall. He climbed onto the roof of his building at Bernauer Strasse 44 and looked down at the west. The distance was terrifying. He shouted for help. On the street below, West Berliners alerted the fire department and the police. A rescue net was stretched out. On one side, democracy was ready to catch him. On the other side, the dictatorship was ready to shoot. East German border guards rushed onto the roof. A struggle broke out at the very edge, on the lip of the wall of bricks. Shots rang out. Bullets flew from east to west. West Berlin police returned fire to protect their firefighters and the man on the roof. In that exchange of gunfire, a VoPos sergeant on the east side was hit in the thigh. Dozens of rounds crossed the borderline in seconds. For one brief, terrifying moment, Bernauer Strasse looked less like a city street and more like a front line. Bernd Linzer did not make it. In the chaos, he fell from the roof and died of his injuries. East German reports would later claim that they had only fired warning shots at a criminal trying to escape. West Berlin reports told another story, a man driven to risk death rather than live locked inside the communist state, police on the free side taking fire while trying to save him, and a wounded VoPos carried away as a political embarrassment. News of the shootout raced up the chain of command. In East Berlin, Interior Minister Karl Marone sent angry protests to West Berlin's mayor and to French commanders responsible for that sector. In the West, American envoy General Lucius Clay met with leaders to assess whether this was the start of something bigger. The world had already watched Soviet and American tanks face off at Checkpoint Charlie. Now, rifle fire on Bernauer Strasse hinted at how quickly the Cold War could go hot. Americans saw something else, too. They saw how fragile the authority of the wall really was. If one man on a rooftop could trigger a gun battle, what would happen when the people of an entire country decided they'd had enough? Yet for the VoPos on the wall, the pressure to obey remained immense. They were told that the frontier was a combat zone. They were told that every fleeing citizen was a traitor, every West Berliner a potential agent, and every American camera pointed at them a weapon and an information war they were supposed to win. That information war was one arena that the Soviets were outmatched. On the Western side, American and Allied intelligence had eyes everywhere. High-resolution cameras on towers, listening posts tuned to East German radio traffic, fast reconnaissance aircraft and satellites passing overhead. Even when the concrete blocks of the wall were still wet, American technology was already mapping every tower, every bunker, every patrol route along the border. The East tried to respond with its own systems, tripwires, automatic firing devices, minefields, floodlights, and patrol dogs. They created a death strip of raked sand and clear fields of fire designed so that any footprint, any shadow, any movement could be detected. But even that was a sign of weakness. You don't need that much concrete and barbed wire to hold your citizens in place if your system is truly loved. Nowhere was this contradiction more brutal than at the water's edge. In the north of the city, near the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery and the Spandau Shipping Canal, the border ran through a narrow strip of water. It looked deceptively simple. One side east, one side west, a set of concrete embankments and a dark, cold canal between them. But in May 1962, that quiet stretch turned into a killing zone. A teenager from the East, around 14 years old, made a desperate decision. He found a way through the border obstacles and plunged into the canal, swimming hard toward the west. On the east bank, border guards spotted him and opened fire. The water around him churned with bullets. He was hit but kept swimming, clawing his way toward the only set of steps in that section of the wall, a narrow stairway up from the canal on the west side. On the west bank, West Berlin police raced to the scene. They saw a bleeding boy, still moving. They moved into position, trying to reach him, to pull him up those steps alive. The East German guards fired again. Their second volley swept across the canal into West Berlin territory, right over the heads of the West Berlin officers. In that moment, the border was not a line anymore. It was a crossfire. This time, the police on the free side did not just stand and watch. They returned fire. A West Berlin officer took careful aim and shot back across the canal to protect the boy at the water's edge. In the confusion, 2 East German guards were hit. One of them was a young conscript named Peter Goering. He had been told he was defending socialism. He was told he was defending peace. He died under the bullets of a police force that had come not to invade, but to save a bleeding child. For the East German regime, the death of Peter Goering became propaganda gold. They named schools and streets after him. They told their citizens that a West Berlin fascist police force had murdered a hero of the people. They never emphasized that those same West Berlin officers had opened fire to protect a 14-year-old boy who had dared to swim across the canal rather than live under their system. The deeper the GDR dug in, the more extreme its tactics became. Take the case of Willy Bloch. He was one of many ordinary people who tried to cross the border in places where it was less visible, outside the famous checkpoints and away from television cameras. He ended up trapped in a terrible limbo, caught in rolls of barbed wire, stuck between East and West, unable to move forward or back. West German customs officers and police on the far side saw him. They grabbed their rifles and sidearms and took cover behind trees and embankments, watching, waiting. On the east side, border guards and their commander rushed to the scene. For a long moment, nobody fired. The man lay there, tangled in steel, the Western officers with guns at the ready, the Eastern commander calculating his options. Then, in a sudden burst of violence, the decision was made. 72 shots. That is how many rounds East German sources later recorded being fired at Willy Bloch. The commander emptied his pistol, then called for a Kalashnikov and fired again at close range. On the other side, the West could only watch. They were armed, they were trained, but to cross the line would mean war. To stay put meant watching an unarmed man being executed in no man's land, in broad daylight, in the shadow of a border the Soviets insisted was anti-fascist protection. This is where the Cold War becomes almost unbearable to retell. You have men in uniform on both sides, armed with 20th century weapons and 20th century radios, watching each other over a strip of land that does not care about ideology. And in that strip are ordinary humans, whose only crime is wanting to live on the side where the lights are brighter at night and the stores are full. If the Eastern system depended only on concrete and guns, it might have lasted longer. But there was another front it could not easily control, the front inside the minds of its own guards. From the earliest days of the wall, some VoPos hesitated. Some aimed high and deliberately missed. Some claimed to not have seen a fleeing figure in the fog. And some, like a young border guard named Konrad Schumann, decided they would not be the jailers of their own country. On August 15, 1961, just 2 days after the barbed wire went up, 19-year-old Konrad Schumann stood at his post along a still makeshift barrier of wire coils on Bernauer Strasse. West Berliners taunted him, shouted to him, begged him to come over. A West German photographer, Peter Liebing, focused his camera on the nervous young man in the gray uniform. Schumann smoked cigarette after cigarette, glancing at the gap in the wire and the police van waiting just beyond it. Then he made his move. He tossed his PPSH-41 submachine gun aside, jumped over the coil of barbed wire, and sprinted toward the West Berlin police vehicle. In mid-air, in a fraction of a second, Liebing captured the most famous photograph of the Berlin Wall, a border guard literally suspended between two worlds, between dictatorship and freedom. To his officers, this was desertion during a combat mission. To the GDR propaganda machine, it was an embarrassment to be erased. To the West, especially to American audiences, it was electrifying. Here was a man who had been entrusted with a weapon and a position of authority by a communist regime, and he had chosen to run toward the people the regime called enemies. No speech from Washington could have carried the same emotional impact. The psychological effect on other guards was immediate. If one could defect, others could too. The Stasi tracked Schumann for years, portraying him as a traitor, while Western media portrayed him as a symbol of human freedom. His leap highlighted a deeper reality. The Soviet system could order men to stand at the wall. It could give them guns, but it could not fully control their hearts. As the years wore on, the pressure built. By the 1970s and 1980s, East German border guards had seen not only local escapes, but also the broader technological gap between East and West. They could look across at Western cars, Western advertising, Western television and radio signals bleeding into their barracks. They heard American music, saw American jeans, and knew that their Soviet-made equipment and propaganda films could not quite compete. One of the most dramatic indicators of internal collapse came later in the Cold War, when a teenage border guard decided not just to walk away from his post, but to shoot his way out. Reports from the time described a young East German conscript who turned his weapon away from the West and toward his own side, firing to suppress his comrades as he scrambled over the barrier to reach West Berlin. In that moment, the border was not a line anymore. It was a crossfire. Imagine the shock in East German headquarters. The wall was supposed to be a line of control. The guards were supposed to be the instruments of that control, and now one of those instruments was firing in the wrong direction. It's hard to find a clearer symbol that the command structure and the belief system behind it were starting to crack. For Americans watching, this fed into a broader narrative that had begun long before the wall was built. They remembered the Berlin airlift, when American and British pilots kept West Berlin alive by flying in supplies around the clock, while Soviet forces tried and failed to starve the city into submission. They remembered the Marshall Plan and the economic boom that followed in Western Europe, contrasted with the shortages and rationing behind the Iron Curtain. And now, on their television screens, they saw East German guards willing to risk their lives to cross into the system that had produced that prosperity. On paper, the Warsaw Pact looked strong. It had millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, and nuclear warheads aimed at Western cities. But the daily reality along the Berlin Wall told a different story. It showed a system that needed landmines and automatic firing devices to keep its citizens from leaving. A system whose own border guards sometimes pointed their guns at each other rather than at the West. By the late 1980s, the numbers spoke for themselves. A comprehensive study would eventually count hundreds of people killed at the inner German border, including at least 24 East German guards. 9 of those guards were killed by fleeing civilians, 8 by their own comrades or accidental friendly fire, 3 by civilians, 3 by American soldiers, and 1 by a West German border guard. The frontier was killing the very men assigned to protect it. And yet, even as the human cost mounted, the East could not match the West in the technological race. NATO surveillance grew more sophisticated. Satellite photography revealed every new bunker, every new fence. Western television beams slipped over the wall like light over a picket fence. For many East Germans, the most powerful piece of American hardware was not a fighter jet or a tank, but a television set that picked up Western channels. Night after night, East German families secretly watched images from the other Germany and from the United States. Modern highways, bustling airports, consumer goods, rock concerts, and political debates where leaders were criticized openly. Compared to the stiff speeches and carefully staged parades on their own state channels, the contrast was devastating. The Soviets could deploy divisions of tanks, but they could not out-broadcast the appeal of a freer, richer, more technologically advanced world. So when you hear stories of VoPos firing over the wall, of West Berlin police firing back, of teenagers swimming through bullets in cold canals, you're not just hearing about local skirmishes. You're hearing about a global competition between two systems fought at the intersection of steel, silicon, and the human soul. On one side, the Soviet model relied on control of movement, control of information, control of speech. On the other side, the American-led model bet on openness and innovation. It trusted that if people could see the difference, they would choose to live where they could think, speak, and invent freely. The Berlin Wall proved that theory in the starkest possible way. In November 1989, after decades of tension along that concrete scar, something snapped. Crowds in East Berlin poured into the streets. Tired border guards, some of them veterans of long nights at checkpoints, faced a sea of their own citizens chanting, singing, demanding passage. The order to shoot never came. The guns stayed silent. Gates were opened. People climbed onto the wall and began to break it apart with hammers and bare hands under the lights of television cameras that beamed the images straight into American living rooms. For the men who had once been VoPos, it was the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a reckoning. Some later faced trial for shootings carried out under the shoot-to-kill orders. Some insisted they had only followed commands. Others admitted they had believed the propaganda and only realized too late what they had done. But all of them lived in the shadow of a border that had turned them into symbols of a system that ultimately could not compete with the combination of American power, Western prosperity, and the simple human desire to be free. Today, when Americans look back at these stories, the emotions are mixed. There is pride in how the United States stood firm, refused to abandon Berlin, and poured resources and technology into defending a city that lay deep inside communist territory. There is fascination with the high-stakes chess match of the Cold War: radar versus radar, spy plane versus missile, satellite versus curtain of secrecy. There's curiosity about the lives of those on the other side, the young guards with rifles who were told that they were on the right side of history until history proved otherwise. But perhaps the most powerful emotion is something deeper. It is the recognition that in the end, the wall did not fall because someone invented a better tank. It fell because the system behind it could not keep up, not with the West's technology, not with its economy, and not with the images, sounds, and stories of a freer world that kept slipping through the cracks. The VoPo defector who fired his way across the border, the young guard who leapt over barbed wire and left his machine pistol behind, the child who swam through bullets while West Berlin police fired back at his pursuers, the man caught in barbed wire while a border commander emptied clip after clip into his helpless body. All of them are part of a single, brutal truth. A state that must shoot at its own citizens to keep them in is already losing. For Americans, those stories have become part of a larger narrative about the Cold War. They are reminders that the contest was never only about missiles and numbers on a map. It was about which side could inspire loyalty without threats, which side could attract defectors rather than hold people at gunpoint, which flag people would run toward when the moment of decision came. On that question, the border guards of the GDR, with their rifles and their searchlights, ended up answering in a way their superiors in Moscow never intended. When they fired across the wall, when they hesitated, when they defected, they showed the world what it looks like when a regime tries to stop the future with concrete. They also showed why, in the long run, it failed. And every time a grainy photograph of a VoPo in midair leaping over the wire appears on a screen in an American home, it quietly tells the same story: that when pushed to the edge, even the guardians of a closed society sometimes choose the light.